So, welcome to the third segment of the Symbols of Sukkos series, third and final. So, previously in the first two classes, we developed some related themes. We talked about, first of all, that there are two aspects of Sukkos. Sukkos commemorates the actual huts that the Jewish people dwell in. It commemorates the clouds of glory that God protected us with in the desert. And these dual aspects find themselves also in the way we look at Sukkos in terms of the calendar cycle. We see Sukkos as the end of the Shalosh Regalim, the three holidays which coincide with the agricultural landmarks. Sukkos being the last, the Chag HaAsif, the time of gathering in your grain. It's a time when a person might get a little bit arrogant over all that they have grown with their great planting skills, and therefore, says the Rashbam, the Sukkah reminds us of that we used to be in the desert, just dwelling in huts, completely with nothing, and the land that we have is the land that God brought us to and that God gave us, and anything that we have comes from God. At the same time, we have Sukkos being at the end of the Yamim Noraim, the high holidays. Follows Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's a time where we celebrate our achieving atonement. And more specifically, according to the Vilna Gaon, it was the time that after the sing of the golden calf, the clouds of glory, which had departed, now returned to the Jewish people. And that happened on the first day of Sukkos, on the 15th of Tishrei. And we're actually celebrating the forgiveness that we achieved. And we last week tied the two ideas together and said that the two might be related, in that what was it that was lacking, that they didn't achieve full forgiveness previously? Why was it that on the day of Sukkos, that's when the clouds of glory returned? And we suggested that it was because that they had just completed collecting all the items needed for, all the materials needed for the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and they had previously messed up by using the bounty that God had provided them to create the golden calf. They took their gold and their riches and used that for negative purposes, when all that we have we're supposed to recognize it comes from God and use it for service of God. And so they rectified that by now donating from their materials for the building of the Mishkan. And when they concretize that by beginning to build the Mishkan, that's when they achieve complete atonement, and that's why the clouds return at that moment. And that's the message of Sukkos, tying back to the idea that that when we were in the desert, we had nothing, to recognize that all that we have comes from God at the time of our harvest, at the time when we might again become arrogant in our ability to amass great wealth. The Sukkah comes to remind us that no, this is from God, and if it comes from God, it's given to us to use in our specific mission in bringing honor to God in this world. And so the atonement that was achieved was really over that idea that they were able now to take that which God had given them and use it in service of God. So today I want to take it one step further. But before we do that, I just came across, I guess you call it a cute idea, which relates to all of this, but I wanted to just share that. So one of the questions that we addressed is a very famous question discussed by many commentaries, which is, why is it that the clouds of glory get a holiday to commemorate them, but there were two other great miracles in the desert that are often associated, sort of the big three, and the other two don't get their own holiday? One is the man that fell daily from heaven to provide manna, to provide food for the people. And the other was the well of Miriam, the spring, the rock that traveled with them in the desert to provide water. Those do not get their own holidays, but the clouds of glory, that third miracle, these are often put together, and the Gemara puts them all together. So the third miracle, the clouds of glory, gets its own holiday. And why is that? So we mentioned one answer, the Mabit says, well, because water and food, those are absolutely necessary. In a certain sense, God had to provide them, otherwise we would die. But the clouds of glory, that was like a bonus. That was an expression of God's love. And so that's what we remember with a special holiday. That was the Mabit's answer. We also said that according to the Vilna Gaon, the question really doesn't start, because according to the Vilna Gaon, we're not celebrating the clouds of glory themselves, but rather what they represented. In fact, we're not celebrating clouds of glory at all, because if it was that, we would be celebrating when they first came at Pesach time. When we first left Egypt, the clouds of glory came for the first time. We don't celebrate Sukkos then. Rather, says the Vilna Gaon, what we are celebrating is when the clouds of glory returned, and the message that carried with it, which was that God had forgiven us. So it's not the clouds of glory themselves that we're celebrating, but rather God's forgiveness. And therefore, the question doesn't really start. The other two are not associated with forgiveness. Those are great miracles, and we should be thankful for them. But they don't get their own holiday, and neither do the clouds of glory get their own holiday. The holiday is about celebrating God's forgiveness of the Jewish people. That's two of the answers. I saw another answer, which again, I would put this in the category of a cute answer, where this was in the, I saw a quote from a work called Sifsei Tzaddik, and he notes that the difference between the Anane Hakavod, the clouds of glory, and the other two miracles is as follows. The other two, the manna and the water, were at times associated with complaining. I put it on the source sheet, the first verse in Bamidbar, Parak Chafal, chapter 21, where the people speak out against God and Moshe. Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in this desert? There's no bread and no water, and we are disgusted with this rotten bread. They were talking about the manna. They were sick of the manna, and they complained about it. So that was the manna. Water, they're always complaining about water. Now, they're not necessarily complaining about the water of the well. They're more complaining when it's not producing water. Before the special well of Miriam started to produce water, after Miriam died, when it stopped producing water. But we see frequently that they are complaining over water and lack of water, and not trusting in God. That don't worry, you don't have to complain. He'll take care of you. So therefore, those two are associated with complaining. They are not associated with joy. They do not get their own holidays. But the Anane Akabot, the clouds of glory, we don't find anywhere that they complained about the clouds of glory. It seemed that they received that gift with joy, with no complaints over it, and therefore it gets its own holiday. Which I think brings us back to our, this general idea revolving around Sukkos is appreciating that what we have is provided by God. In this case, it reminds us, not to complain. Whatever we are given is God-given. It's destined for us. It's meant for us. We get what we are supposed to get, and we should appreciate it rather than complain about it. Okay, that's really not going to be our focus. That's a little side point. What I want to talk about in this final segment is the very special service that was performed in the temple in the Beis HaMikdash on Sukkos, which was the Nisuch Hamayim, the water libations. So throughout the year, the offerings on the altar in the temple were accompanied by wine libations. There was wine poured on the altar along with the offerings. But there was never water poured on the altar with the offerings, except for once a year. One time a year, the holiday of Sukkos, with the daily morning offering, it's called the Karban Tamid, and it was specifically with the morning Karban Tamid, they would not only give the animal offering, not only pour wine on the altar, but they would also pour water on the altar. This was called Nisuch Hamayim, the pouring of the water. And it's the Gemara, the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah tells us that the reason that they poured water at this time of year on Sukkos is because on Sukkos we are actually judged on water for the year. So that's a Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. The Mishnah says that it's talking about different periods of the year where we're judged for different things. The Mishnah says that on Rosh Hashanah we are each individually judged, but on Sukkos we are judged on water. Now, what does that mean? If we're judged individually on Rosh Hashanah, seemingly we are allotted however much water we're going to get, unless it's like a judgment that everything except water, like what's this additional judgment that's occurring on Sukkos? So the commentaries explain. The Ramban says, well, actually, the individuals are judged on Rosh Hashanah, how much water each individual will receive. The world at large is judged on Sukkos for how much water the world at large will receive. And of course, we want the right amount. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. That's a significant time of judgment. And because of that, we have a special service, which is the Nisuch Hamayim, the pouring of the water on the altar. This service is not mentioned explicitly in the Torah. It is what we call halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It is a tradition given to Moshe, handed down from generation to generation. It is a Torah mitzvah, but it's never mentioned explicitly. It is hinted to in the Torah, in the section that deals with the offerings of Sukkos. It's hinted to, but it is not mentioned explicitly. Okay, but maybe more famous than the pouring of the water itself, the libations themselves, was the great celebration that accompanied the drawing of the water each evening of Sukkos, at least when it wasn't Chag, it wasn't the holiday, it wasn't the Yom Tov, and that's what we refer to as the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, the celebration at the house of drawing. And nowadays we have parties on Sukkos. We call them Simchas Beis HaShoeva. It's a memory, it's a commemoration of that great celebration which took place on the Temple Mount in the days of the Temple of the Beis HaMikdash, when they did actually do the water libations. And the Mishnah in Tractate Sukkah describes for us a little bit of what this celebration looked like. So let's take a look. If you have the source sheet, great. If not, you could just listen in. So we're on the third box on the source sheet, and the Mishnah says as follows: one who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of the water, one who did not see a Simchas Beis HaShoeva, never saw a celebration in his days. If you'd never witnessed this, you never saw joy. In the Hebrew, V'ra Simcha Miyamav. If you didn't see the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, then you never saw joy in your life. And then it goes on to describe what it looked like. So even before, we can just wonder about that statement, right? What does that mean? If you never witnessed this, you never witnessed joy. We've hopefully all experienced joy at different times. What was it? So what was so special about this event that the sages make such a statement? If you didn't see it, you never saw joy. So that's one question I hope we can deal with. Now, the Mishnah goes on to describe in detail what this celebration looked like. And it says that on the conclusion of the first festival day, so Sukkot is broken up. There's one day of Yom Tov, and then Chol HaMoed, then the intermediary days. Now, outside of Israel, we do 2 days of Yom Tov, but in Israel, by Torah law, it's just 1 day of Yom Tov, followed by the intermediary days, so where there are less restrictions. So at the conclusion of the first day of Yom Tov, first day of the festival, so it says that they would go down, and the priests and the Levites descending from the Israelites' courtyard, the women's courtyard, and there were golden candelabras atop poles there in the courtyard. There were 4 basins made of gold at the top of each candelabrum. There were 4 ladders for each and every pole, and there were 4 children from the priesthood trainees, and in their hands were pitchers with the capacity of 120 load of oil that they would pour into each and every basin. So you can imagine this large courtyard in the temple, or in front of the temple, really, and they in the courtyard they had these very tall poles, and on top of the poles were these very large basins, and those were to hold oil that they would then light, and they had the ladders leading up to them, and they would fill these with a great amount of oil. And the Mishnah records there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem that was not illuminated from the light of the place of the drawing of the water, the light of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. So they lit these enormous lamps, it seems, and it lit up, it says, every courtyard in the city of Jerusalem. And then they would have this great celebration. The pious and the men of action would dance before the people who attended the celebration with flaming torches that they would juggle in their hands. They would say before them passages of song and praise to God. This all-out celebration. Again, this is associated with the drawing of the water. So this is the night before the service each morning. Each morning they would pour the water with the morning offering. The night before they would draw the water from the nearby stream, and there was a procession that would accompany them, bringing this water back to the temple to be used the next morning, and this was the celebration that was associated with it. Okay, so there was these great lamps, there was all this great dancing, an enormous celebration. Now, one more point, the Talmud elaborates in describing this, and it tells us, this is in the same box, the second half of the box, one of the sages taught, it was so bright that a woman would be able to sort wheat by the light of the celebration of the place of the drawing of the water, by the light of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. So we said that the light there was not a single courtyard in Jerusalem that wasn't lit by the light of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. And then the Talmud says, by the way, let me tell you one more thing. It was so light that a woman could sort wheat by the light of by this light. Now it's interesting because Tosfos, one of the great medieval commentaries, comments on this, and he says, well, that's a problem because you're not actually allowed to benefit from the property of the temple for mundane things. So how could it say that she could sort her wheat by the light of these lamps? These lamps belong to the temple, and you wouldn't be able to use such light for mundane matters. So Tosfos actually says, well, actually, it doesn't mean that women actually did it. It was just saying that they could have. It was so light that they could have done it. So wonderful, great. So there was a lot of light, right? Why do I need to know this? Right? Okay, so they had these great lamps. Fine, you tell me there was a lot of light. You tell me there was so much light it lit up every courtyard. Okay, I get the idea, right? No. There was even more light than you thought. There was so much light that a woman could even sort wheat in her home from it. And by the way, says Tosfos, it doesn't actually mean that she did it. She just could have, right? What's this coming to add for me? Why exactly am I, pardon the pun, but why does this illuminate for me more than to just know that there was a lot of light? So we have a number of questions here. What's the big deal? First of all, why? So it's nice we get to pour water once a year, right? Why such a celebration? What's so special about this service that they were pouring water on the altar? It's so special that we have accompanied with it a tremendous celebration, such a celebration that the Mishnah says that if you never saw it, you never saw joy. What's this great joy that the Mishnah is referring to? And furthermore, what's with all the light? And why is it important that it lit up even a woman who was sorting wheat by the light of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. So I want to share with you an idea from Rav Moshe Feinstein. And Rav Moshe Feinstein explained that the secret or the depths of the service of the Nisuch HaMayim, of the pouring of the water libations, what made it so special was that it contained a very important message. And that is that a person might have thought, a person might think, I have what I have, right? God has given me a meager income. I can't serve God like somebody who has great wealth and comfort and great means. I can't make that huge donation to donate a building, for an organization. I can't support all the poor. I can't afford the nicest items to do my mitzvos with. So maybe my service of God is somehow less than that of people of greater means. That's what someone might have thought. What the water libation comes to teach us is what the Talmud actually refers to at the end of Tractate Menachos. It says a famous line. It says, "Echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamit." Whether one does a lot or does a little, whether it's talking about how much you give, really, whether you give a lot, whether you give a little, whatever you can do, as long as as long as you are doing it for the sake of God. You're doing it for the sake of heaven. And what it teaches me is that a person can serve God with whatever they have, right? Wine, I understand. Libations of wine. Wine is like, the drink, that represents importance and class, and it's expensive and it's meaningful, right? But water, I could just go down to the river. Anybody could, just go fill up a cup. It's one of the cheapest and most accessible commodities out there. Obviously, it's important, but you use that to something so common to show your devotion to God, right? It seems like a cheap way out. But the Mishnah, what the service of the pouring of the water taught us, what it teaches, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, is that it's not so much about how much you have and about what you're using, but it's more about a person's heart. It's more about a person's intent. You can take water and use it to serve God. Now, this doesn't mean that we can make up our own services, right? And say, well, I'm going to invent my own way of serving God using start pouring orange juice because that's what I have in my fridge. Like I can use anything to serve God, right? No, there's still specific ways in which we do it. But the message is that even water could be used in the service of God. And to take it a step further, he says that really what this shows me is that if I can use water to serve God, I can use anything to serve God. I could use the orange juice in my fridge. Now, I shouldn't use it as a libation. That's not the way that I can serve God with the orange juice. But anything that I have can be used in the service of God. If water could, if the main aspect that God looks for is that we do it for the sake of heaven, so then really anything could be used in the service of God if it's done for the sake of heaven. There's different ways that one might do something for the sake of heaven. Let's say, again, I did not plan the orange juice example before I gave this class today, but now that we're using the orange juice example, how do I serve God with my orange juice, right, in my fridge? So I'm not going to use it for a libation on the altar, but I can use it to make a blessing and appreciate God's goodness. I can use it and share it with somebody. Anything that I've been given can be rededicated and designated in the service of God. And what that means is something very life-changing and transformative, right? That at any moment, anything that I could be doing, anything that I have, I can be involved in serving God. And that could give tremendous meaning to a person's life. Yes, I want to relax, right? We all have to relax sometimes, right? But if there's relaxing, then there's relaxing. If I'm relaxing because I know I need to relax, I need to relax in order to be a better servant of God. So all of a sudden, my relaxing is not just relaxing. Now I'm actually serving God when I'm relaxing. I need to eat. If I do it for the purpose of serving God better, if I do it in order to make a blessing, right? Like the famous story of the Hasidic Rebbe who he probably different versions of the story, but he made a blessing. He bit into an apple, and one of his students said, what's the difference between when you're this great Rebbe, you make a blessing in eating an apple, and I make a blessing in eating an apple. What's the difference between you and me? And the Rebbe said, the difference is that when I wake up in the morning, I look outside and I see a beautiful apple tree, and I say that I want to be able to thank God for this beautiful apple tree. I want to make a blessing, praising God. And so I eat the apple in order to make a blessing. You wake up in the morning and see a beautiful apple tree. You say, I want to eat an apple. I like to enjoy an apple. I know to eat an apple, I have to make a blessing. So the difference, says the Rebbe, between you making a blessing eating an apple and me making a blessing and eating an apple is that I eat the apple in order to make the blessing, and you make the blessing in order to eat the apple. But the idea is that really in every nook and cranny, in every corner, in every case, situation in our life, we really could be involved in avodas Hashem and serving God. And that is perhaps the tremendous joy that was experienced at the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. That when we can celebrate, when we bring up the water and we say, at any moment I can be involved in something meaningful in serving God, that's truly something to celebrate, and that's truly something that should bring a person tremendous joy, because meaning brings us joy. And if we can consistently experience meaning, and not just meaning, but connection to God brings a person joy. It's maybe a spiritual thing, but being connected to God brings a person joy. And so if at any moment that's possible, then there's no joy like that. That's the celebration of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. And that's the statement. If you never saw Simchas Beis HaShoeva, you never really experienced joy. Of course, we've all had joyous occasions, right? But to be able to experience it consistently, so then you need the message of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. You need the message of every moment of my life could be meaningful. Every moment could be a time of connection. Every moment could be a time of joy. And perhaps that explains the whole idea with the light. What was the light of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva? Why they have to light up the courtyards of Jerusalem, right? So not everybody could make it to the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. There's only room for a certain number of people. People were busy. They had to put the kids to sleep, right? They can't always make it. They didn't have the Zoom option. So the light reached every courtyard. Everybody could feel as if they were there and get the message of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. And even a woman who needed to sort her wheat, or was able to sort wheat by the light of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. Now, again, Tosfos says she couldn't actually do it because you're not allowed to benefit from the light. But the example of the Talmud, the reason why it gives that example perhaps is this message. It's not that she actually would sort her wheat, but when she did sort her wheat, she could do it with the light of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. She could do it with the message of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. She might say it's not fair. Here I am. I need to bake. I need to get dinner ready. I'd rather be involved in something spiritual, something meaningful, and instead, what am I doing? I'm sorting wheat, right? Like what kind of a life is this? There's no meaning in this, right? No. The light of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva touched on even the most basic activities and says, no, that also can be meaningful. It's all about our perspective. It's all about how we look at it. yes, if we look at it as something simple and mundane, then it's simple and mundane. If we realize that I'm doing something that's going to help me, help my family in our ability to serve God, then that itself is serving God. That itself is a mitzvah. That itself is an elevated activity. And so that's what it means that even a woman who was sorting wheat could sort wheat by the light of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. The message and the light of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva was able to touch a person, carrying a message for every scenario in life, that we could dedicate each and everything that we do towards gaining a closer connection to God, towards furthering our performance of God's commandments. Okay. Now, beautiful, right? Beautiful idea, very meaningful. And really, I think that this takes everything that we talked about in previous classes, or really mostly last week, and takes it a step further. So last week we said that we have to realize that everything that we have is given to us by God. This was Yaakov Avinu, right? Jacob, he went back for the small jugs because he recognized that if God gave it to him, it somehow could be used in the service of God. And that was the people donating to their materials to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle. This takes it a step further, right? It's not just that it could be used, but it should be used, and that's exactly the message of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, that all of those worldly possessions that we're graced with, when we do use them, we should try, to have in mind that what we're doing is for the sake of heaven, and that itself turns those activities and the uses of those things into a mitzvah. Now, in order to do this, we really have to develop our sense of being in God's presence at all times. The Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, begins, I think at least the glosses of Moshe Isserles, with the idea of Shivisi Hashem Lenegdi Samid, that a person should try to view themselves as walking before God at all times, because at all times we are standing before God, and that's the perspective that we really need to work on, need to develop in order to arrive at this lesson, or to arrive at, to put into practice this lesson of everything that we do to be for the sake of heaven. In order to do so, we really have to have a sense at all times that we're standing before God. And I would suggest that that's really the process of teshuvah that we try to go through during this time of year, really leading up to Sukkos and culminating in Sukkos. The Mabit, or Moshe Detrani, who we quoted the first week, he has a section in his work, Beis Elokim, and the section is the Gate of Teshuvah. And in that section, he defines what Teshuvah is. And the definition that he gives for Teshuvah is as follows. He says, Teshuvah meaning repentance, returning really. Teshuvah is drawing near to God from the distance caused by sin. In Hebrew, kreva la Hashem, drawing near to God, meirichu kachet, from the distance caused by sin. Now, the way that he does this, he gives a definition, then he breaks it down. He goes through each. Why did he use the word drawing near? Why did he use the word to Hashem? Why did he use the word from the distance? And why is from the caused by sin? And he goes through each one. When he talks about the distance, when he talks about drawing near to God from the distance caused by sin, he says, what do we mean that sin makes us distant from God? So I think most of us think about that sort of as like a conceptual idea. If I'm sinning, it means I'm far from God, right? If I'm doing God's will, I'm close to God, right? It puts a distance between us. He puts like a practical spin on it. He says that if a person was standing in the presence of a king in the throne room, they would not defy the king's word. They would do exactly as the king wills. Now, when they leave the king's throne room, well, then all bets are off. But in the presence of the king, one follows the king's will. He says, we know that the entire world is filled with God's glory. The entire world is God's throne room. So if a person strays from God's will, so what are they saying? In effect, they're saying, I'm not in the throne room. If I was, if I knew that I was before God, then I would do exactly as God wills. So why does a person slip up? Because they don't sense themselves as being in front of God. So in effect, when a person sins, they're really expressing a distance. I'm not inside. I'm outside. If I was inside, then I wouldn't have done this. If I was in it must be the person is at a distance. Teshuvah means, he says, to draw near again, to come back into the room, to come back to be before God. Teshuvah, again, the word teshuvah means to return. It means to return to the throne room, to return to being before God. That's what teshuvah is. And once a person is back in the throne room, is back in this sense, in this mode of I'm before God, so then, number one, they won't transgress God's will. Number two, they will do the things that they're supposed to do. But number three, everything that they do will be with God in mind. I'm before God. Everything that I do should be with for the sake of heaven. Now, of course, to maintain such a frame of mind at all times is not easy. A life's work, and probably only the greatest people have achieved that truly, but at least we can maybe check in, every so often and remind ourselves when we make a blessing, right? Before we eat, we make a blessing. So besides for thanking God, it also reminds us that I'm here before God. When we pray, at the very least, when a person prays, to have the presence of mind that they're praying to God, right? And they're not just saying words, right? At certain points in the day, we remind ourselves that we're in God's throne room. And then when we are involved in various activities, we can also have that frame of mind. But this begins at the beginning of Elul, really, where we begin to do teshuvah. Certainly with the blasts of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, the blast of the shofar is part of it is to bring our zikaron, our memory before God. We do that really effectively by bringing God's presence to us. Then our presence goes before God. The Gemara actually says that when we blow shofar, it's like we're in the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So the shofar is a step in that direction, a reminder that we're in the presence of God, part of this process to get to this frame of mind. But ultimately, I think it culminates with Sukkos. And Sukkos is the greatest expression of this idea of everything you do should be for the sake of heaven. Because if you think about it, what is the mitzvah? What is the commandment of the sukkah? So the mitzvah is not to build the sukkah. That's not the mitzvah. What is the mitzvah? What's the commandment? The commandment is to live in the sukkah. How do I fulfill the commandment? By living, by eating, by sleeping, by doing whatever I need to do. Whatever I would do in my house, I should do in the sukkah. We call it Teshvu Ke'en Taduru. You should dwell in the sukkah the way that you live in your house. But I'm not doing anything, right? I'm just, how is this a mitzvah? It's nice that I'm doing it in the sukkah, but what am I doing already? I'm just eating, I'm just sleeping, right? So the sukkah is this very idea. The sukkah is, we come after we go through a process of teshuvah, we go through a process of bringing ourselves back into the throne room, back into the presence of God, then we can go out to the sukkah and just be in God's presence, where everything we do is serving God. Just the very act of living in the sukkah. That's ultimately the message that we're trying to get to in this time of year. We are reminded by the sukkah and the messages of sukkah that all that we have comes from God. We're reminded that all that God provides me, I can use in the service of God. And we're reminded then that not only can I, but I should use everything in the service of God. And if I do, it will bring great joy, like the joy of the Simchas Pesach Shoeva. And I express this lesson, this idea, by then actually living it. I live it in the sukkah. I go and live in the sukkah, where my very living there is the mitzvah itself. And I see this idea brought to reality, that everything that I do can be a mitzvah, can be used in the service of God. All I'm doing is eating, all I'm doing is sleeping, and yet I'm doing a mitzvah, because it's the will of God. Even my eating, even my sleeping can be a mitzvah. And that's what the sukkah represents. And at the very end of Sukkos, the Torah tacks on one more day, right? And that one more day is called Shemini Atzeres. It's like another day of Sukkos, except for it's not. It's not Sukkos anymore. The eighth day is not Sukkos anymore. It's its own holiday. It's called Shemini Atzeres. Now, in outside of Israel, most people have the custom to still eat in the sukkah. That again has to do with the whole thing with 2 days of Yom Tov. It might be the last day of Sukkos, really. But in Israel, the eighth day, it's not Sukkos at all. You don't eat in the sukkah on Shemini Atzeres. It's because it's not Sukkos anymore. What is Shemini Atzeres? So the idea of Shemini Atzeres, Rashi quotes, it's on the second page of the source sheet. The Torah says Atzeres. It's a day of detention, where God says, I have detained you, remain with me. And Rashi gives an analogy based on the Midrash. It's analogous to a king who invited his sons to feast with him for a certain number of days. And when the time came for them to leave, he said, my sons, please stay with me just one more day. It is difficult for me to part with you. Kasha alai predastem. It's hard for me to see you go. Stay with me for one more day. Now, what is the idea behind Shemini Atzeres? What is the idea of stay one more day, right? And then what? It's going to be easier to see us go the next day. What does God gain, so to speak, by keeping us for one more day? He's just prolonging the agony of the separation. But the idea really is that, no, it's not supposed to just be one more day. The idea is that it's supposed to take us more than one more day. It's supposed to last us through the whole winter and the whole year. You see, we go out to the sukkah and we're living with God. Everything we do is God's will. Everything that we do. We are using everything that we have for the sake of heaven. Shemini Atzeres says, now bring it back into the home. You have one more day. It's not in the sukkah. It's in the home. Now bring it back in the home. In fact, the Targum Yonasan, one of the ancient Aramaic translations of the Torah, when he translates this pasuk, he says it should be a day where on the eighth day. It's actually a different verse, but one of the verses that talks about Shemini Atzeres, it should be a day where you come inside to your house with joy. And it doesn't say that in the Torah. That's his explanation. What's he saying? It's a day where you come back into the house. That's the day. Shemini Atzeres is the holiday in which you come back in. But what is that? It means you take the lessons of Sukkos and you bring them back into the house. It's the day where you extend Sukkos, but now back in the house. When I was in the sukkah, everything I did was a mitzvah. Everything I did was for the sake of heaven. I ate for the sake of heaven. I slept for the sake of heaven. I played board games for the sake of heaven. I learned Torah for the sake of heaven. Everything I did was for the sake of heaven. Shemini Atzeres says, now come back into the house and bring that back with you. Take this is the culmination of this entire process of teshuvah, of returning to God. Now bring it back and live in your own home in that manner. Live in your own home with the knowledge that you are actually in God's throne room at every moment of your life. Everything that we are given can be and should be used in the act of serving God. And that is, I think, ultimately the meaning and message, or one important message behind this special holiday coming up. I wish everybody before Yom Kippur a Gemar Chasima Tovo. You should be sealed for a good year. And I hope that what we've learned will enhance everybody's holiday of Sukkos coming up.
Yashkoach, Rabbi.